Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We thank Allah for His mercy for bringing us together this afternoon to enjoy another interesting lecture from one of our guest scholars and who is also an in-house member. However, it is impossible to start an Islamic gathering without saying "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, wassalatu wassalam ala ashrafil mursalin, sayyidina wa nabiyyina wa maulana wa mutahhana Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Wala ibadillahi salihin, ya jami'atul muslimin, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praises, admiration is due to Allah, and we say peace and blessings upon His noble Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May these peace and blessings extend to Muhammad, his household, and those who stay on the path of Jannah until the day of Jannah. And may it also extend to us who are following the path of Muhammad. Amen. In our usual practice in our association of Salatul Rahman, we bring in scholars from across the world at different points in the month or in the week to come and speak to us. Alhamdulillah, today we have decided to go in-house, and then we have brought in one of our fathers, one of our brothers, one of our foundation members who is also a pride to Salatul Rahman, the Muslim community, the Nigerian community, and the entire human race. Today we'll be discussing the global impact of COVID-19 on healthcare, education with emphasis on education in Nigeria and the UK. It needs no further introduction because as soon as I mention the name, or once I mention his name, and those of you who have seen his flyer, will know that he is a man who needs no introduction. However, we have to follow the formality of starting a seminar. I'll call this a seminar by introducing our guest as guest today, Professor Ibrahim Gbajabiamila. For those of you who don't know, and for those of you who know already, or for the purpose of history, I will have to remind you that Professor Gbajabiamila was one of the foundation members of Salatul Rahman. Just like I said earlier, he's a pride to all of us and to the entire Muslim community worldwide. Professor Gbajabiamila was born in Lagos, in Nigeria, and he received his primary and secondary education in London. He then proceeded to the University of London in 1976 to study microbiology. He remained at the same university as a research student, and in 1984, he obtained his PhD in virology. He also remained at the university before he went to university. He thought he was a lecturer in university. After that, he went to the University of East London. From there, he proceeded to Nigeria as a visiting professor. Then later, he was appointed the deputy vice chancellor and later the vice chancellor of University of Crescent in Abeokuta in 2010-2021. Professor Ibrahim Gbajabiamila is a member of several international organizations and bodies. For instance, he's a member of the Institute of Learning and Teaching. He's a member of the Forensic Society of UK. He's a member of the Institute of Biology. He's a chartered biologist. He's a fellow of the Lincoln Society, and he's a man of many honors. When he went back to Nigeria, his contribution to academic was also recognized. For instance, in 2019, he won the Excellence in Education Leadership Award from the University of Ife, which is now University of Obafemi Awolowo University. Also in 2019, he won the NANS Education Leadership Award. In 2016, he won the ICAD Fellowship for Contribution to Education Development in Nigeria. In 2016 as well, he won the Nelson Mandela Award for Education Leadership in Africa. In 2015, he won the Education Icon of Africa Education Icon of the Year Award from Taishola University. And I don't want to go on and on because if we start reading through his honors, we may not be able to finish, and that will eat so much into our time. However, just like I said, if you want to know more about him, just put Gbajabiamila in Google search, and everything you find, you can add it to this. It is a humble pleasure to have Professor Ibrahim Gbajabiamila in our midst, and we do hope that whenever we call on him, he will answer to our call. Brothers and sisters, our fellow listeners across the world, without much ado, I want to invite Professor Gbajabiamila to the platform. Bismillah, Prof. The floor is yours now.
Sallallahu alaihi
wasallam.
A few protocols before starting the lecture. I want to thank His Excellency Prince Bola Ajibola, founder and proprietor of Crescent University, the Royal Majesty Oba Adeyemi Alaafin of Oyo, the Chancellor of Crescent University, Abeokuta, His Royal Majesty Alhaji Adamu, the Emir of Kazuri, the Pro-Chancellor and Chairman of Governing Council of Crescent University, Abeokuta, Barrister Muhammad Maruf Ajibola San. I also have His Royal Majesty Obalan Rege, the Lota of Ota, who is also joining us, and His Royal Majesty, the Oba of Lagos. I want to thank the Crescent University Academic Council, staff, students, governing council, and the alumni. They are also joining us. This meeting is what I would call a family meeting with the world listening in. I think you once invited me 15 years ago to deliver a lecture on education of our children in diaspora. And I think in that meeting, there were just about 200 of us in mosque. I think the meeting today is similar, but with technology to a wider audience. We will be having people who are part of the academic community joining us from the USA, Malaysia, Singapore, and India, wider academics and other people that we don't know, but at least it's been widely circulated. So the lecture would focus on our issues between Nigeria and Lagos and London, how we have been able to implement. So the existing protocol to also thank the Asalatu Rahman for inviting me, and also to acknowledge the management stakeholders, Imam Khalifa Najimuddin, the chairman of the EOT, Alhaji Tajuddin Yusuf, the acting Imam Khalifa Sharifuddin Adekuna Keushala, management of the interim committee, Alhaji Abdulrazak Buraola. There are a number of groups that I have not seen for a number of years, but I want to acknowledge them. The Elders Group, of which I'm a member, Somaria Adini Sisters Group, Marufa Sisters, Faith United, Majo Baje Adini Sisters Group, Ashiwaju Adini Sisters Group, Rahman Sisters Group, Kumfa Yakum Sisters Group. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I will now proceed to lectures. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most benevolent, all praises and honor and adoration are due to only Allah, the great and all-knowing Lord of the universe, who has taught mankind all He knew. All praises go to Almighty Allah for the opportunity for us to gather here again and partake in this event. May His everlasting peace, blessing be on the soul of our noble Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his household, companions, and all the followers of the noble Prophet till the day of judgment. I want to thank you for this opportunity, and as I said, this lecture is for a wider audience, so I will try to be as less technical as possible. But I think the lecture, we have to start with the history of pandemics. We have to acknowledge that what is happening to us now is not the beginning or a new phenomenon. And I think by the end of this lecture, you will see that there is a cycle. And the cycle of these pandemics is something that humanity has been grappling with. If we were to go back to the history of pandemics, I will then go through and arrive as to where we are today with COVID-19, and also speculate on what we need to do in future. And of course, address the issue of impact on health, impact on education. When we look at the history of pandemics, it goes back to prehistoric times, and I think that when we look at both the Quran and the Bible have a number of cases of pandemics and how they were coped with. But just to give you some example, one of the most preserved and clear-cut is 3000 BC. Manga. This is in China. It's a village in China which has been well preserved, which shows the plague and how the pandemic, the range of bodies that are there. You can also check that one. 430 BC, the plague of Athens. Again, that was a plague that almost wiped out an entire city and population. 165 AD, plague of Anthem, again very serious. 250 AD, plague of Cyprian. 541 AD, known as the Justinian plague. This is a pivotal plague that almost wiped out the Byzantine Empire. 50 million people died. 1541 AD, plague of Justinian. 1346 to 1353 is the Black Death, which was caused by a bacterium. 200 million people died. That Black Death by a bacterium on fleas that feeds from rodents. 1545 to 1548, we had the Cocoletto, 15 million people killed. That plague caused mainly by salmonella, and salmonella, which is a food poisoning. 1665, which everybody in London will be aware of in terms of the museum and various monuments. 1665 to 1666 is known as the Great Plague of London. That is quite significant because over 100,000 people died. It wiped out 15% of the population of London. The Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. Other notable pandemics is 1485, known as the Spanish flu, which again, 15,000 died. In those eras, there have been different attempts to understand and go back and investigate how this pandemic occurred, what lessons can we learn from them. In the modern era, pandemics in the 20th century, one of the most significant is smallpox. 300 million people died. Smallpox has almost just been wiped out, but there's still pockets of it. But the WHO has more or less said that we're on top of that. One of the most significant pandemic, the modern era, is what we know as the 1918 flu pandemic. This is also another important historical development in pandemics. We had between 50 and 100 million people were killed. This is higher than those that were killed in the First World War. The influenza 1918 pandemic. I think that is very, very important that this pandemic again originated from a virus with avian origin. And of course, we're all aware of the HIV and the modern era. So far, 30 million people killed with 75 million infected. That has remained unconquered to a certain extent with a number of interventions. Just to go back to, again, people may not be aware of the Lassa fever, which we currently have in Nigeria. The Lassa fever originated or was found in a village in Nigeria called Lassa in the Borno State in 1969. That Lassa fever has remained with us, and in fact, it is the Covid-19 that has overshadowed the Lassa fever in Nigeria. We have had a number of cases of Lassa fever, the outbreak in 2018 of Lassa fever, 90 people died. In 2019 in Nigeria, 167 people died. And in 2020 and currently, 144 have died from Lassa fever. So it was Lassa fever that we were grappling with before COVID-19 came in. But in the past, the WHO figure suggested that 5,000 people have died of Lassa fever. If we now come down to 2002 to 2004 is when we first heard of SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. This again originated from China. And this SARS is important because it's related to COVID-19 that we're now discussing. the SARS-CoV-1, and the current one is seen as SARS-CoV-2. But those are the issues that historically, and we'll go back to discussing that in due course. But of course, there have been other pandemics, viruses, the Zika virus, which is still with us, 2015 to the present day. This one is spread by mosquitoes, is prevalent in South and Central America. I want to digress and look at how we have looked at another important virus epidemic that remains with us is the Ebola virus that you are well aware of. And there's a long story about this. The origination of the Ebola virus is 1976, Yamboku village in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is suspected to have been a monkey virus, and the viruses that jump from animals into human population. And I think this is a very important point that we have to bear in mind, that viruses cannot exist on their own. They need a host, and they need to be in that host to replicate, divide, and pass on. And of course, when they get, when a particular thing is infected and is transmitted to the human being, then there comes to the problem. So the Lassa, the Ebola virus is an important one for us, which originated in bats in Democratic Republic of Congo in 1976. But I want to just concentrate on the Ebola virus that occurred, the pandemic in West Africa in 2014 to 2016. This is a significant for us as to how we deal with the current pandemic. The West African outbreak in 2014, because this Ebola virus, as we know, has a 70% death rate. It is a very deadly virus. And in Liberia, it originated in Liberia, Guinea, and spread to Sierra Leone. And over 11,000 people were killed. And of course, those of you know the geography, these countries in West Africa are close proximity to Nigeria and to Lagos. And I think that there is an important aspect of what happened when virus reached Lagos, Nigeria. I think we need to dwell on this because it's what I consider one of our finest hour, and in terms of an heroic stand by the doctors involved. The case, the index case, Patrick Soa came to Lagos. He was coming for an ECOWAS meeting. He's a government employee of the Liberian government, and he was coming for an ECOWAS meeting. He arrived at Lagos Airport 2014, and he collapsed at the airport. And of course, during that period, the public hospitals and the public health system was on strike. So he was taken to a private facility in Ikoyi. And fortuitously, the consultant on duty, Dr. Stella Adadevo, real reign of the Federation, she admitted him and diagnosed, because at that time there had been no diagnosis of virus in Nigeria, but because of knowledge and understanding of its spread from Sierra Leone, Guinea, Liberia, she was able to ask for him to be detained. And this led to a diplomatic incident in which the Liberian government accused the Nigerian government of kidnapping. The Liberian ambassador to Nigeria accused Dr. Stella Dadevo that they would sue the Nigerian government, and she was detaining a Liberian subject without due cause. Don't forget that this is somebody who is not a government worker, but in a private capacity. But what is significant here is that she was convinced of the index case, and she said, for the public good, and for the common good. I think we have to bear that in mind, that that person should be detained. And she was supported by her medical director, that in a sense had a situation where, on the diplomatic level, there were lots of threats, and in fact, as this showed, the Liberian ambassador threatened her that they would take action. But luckily, as they were doing the tests and doing the uh, confirmation, uh, the test proved positive that this was the index case of Ebola coming into Nigeria. Of course, the person involved was very adamant that he was virus free, and that he's being detained against his wish, and he wanted to attend the ECOWAS meeting in Lagos. And of course, he was agitated, he was on feed, and he basically just lost it and pulled all the wires surrounding him and spread the blood within that facility. The story, as a result of that, having been found positive, the brave decision of Dr. Stella Dadevo to detain him was confirmed, but unfortunately, she and other colleagues were victims of actually being infected by the patient. They did not have the PPE and various other interventions, but by just that singular action, she was able to prevent the spread of the disease in Lagos, in Nigeria. Given the size of the country with 200 million people, and the fact that this disease, Ebola, had killed quite a number of people in Benin, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. And I think the reason why I said it's one of our finest moments is that once the place was positive, the contact tracing was coordinated, and the WHO reported that Nigeria took a rapid, coordinated response in contact tracing. There were 900 contacts that he had made, and they conducted face-to-face interviews with 18,500 people. And the work was coordinated in the virology laboratory of the Lagos University Teaching Hospital. So as I said, here was a virus. If it had got into the community through Lagos, it would have been quite disastrous. The other reason I think we should also be grateful is that the index case, Patrick Sower, came through the airport. Now, those of you know, with our neighboring countries, only 1% uses the airport. Most of the borders are porous, and people could easily travel by road and bring it into the country. But by virtue of its collapse at the Lagos airport, we were able to mount a solid defense in quarantine, and more or less, as I said, when you look in retrospect, the intervention of the Liberian government, the Liberian ambassador, saying their subject was not positive. Those are lessons we will learn with COVID-19. Essentially, as I said, as a result of that intervention in the brave act of Sarah Dadevo, she died on the 19th of August 2014 from this Ebola virus, which was brought in by that index case. So that is the history and the way we have looked at the spread of the disease. I think also there were a number of cases we had international assistance, WHO, big laboratories in the US and the UK, and there are people whose job through the other agencies, the NGOs, supported the West African subcontinent in terms of fighting the virus, because the nature of modern travel would mean that people would move and spread. A virus that started in the Congo, a small village, finally resurrects in Lagos, Sierra Leone, Liberia. So the nature of travel meant that the interconnectivity and interdependence of all nations that you would have. And those are lessons that we'll bring forward when we think about what has happened with COVID-19. I think we've looked at this history of pandemics, traced it to current era. What I'll have to just briefly again to talk about the COVID-19 being a work in progress, because essentially we are in the middle of it, and the understanding of SARS-1, which 2002 that I mentioned, which again originated from China, and again was suggested that it had been a virus that crossed over from animals by consumption to the current situation. So what we are looking at, 2002, 2004, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which was the description of the symptoms. Over 800 people died, but it then went more or less under control, but we've not been able to find a vaccine for it. But what is important here is that the cycle of that virus and how it happened is entirely different with COVID-19. The similarity is 86%. The genome map of first SARS and the current one is similar, but the COVID-19, as it's called, is now much more deadly. COVID-2, as it's often referred to, the transmissibility is actually much more than we imagine. So the timeline for COVID-19, again, is under investigation, but clearly around December 2019, it was reported in the Wuhan district in China, severe active respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, known as COVID-19. That, again, thrown the international community once the spread was known. The different responses between the UK and different parts of the world, it's well known that we have a situation where if it has happened, and other people believe it's a conspiracy, there are a number of arguments, but let us put those aside and deal with the facts. I think as a scientist, we have to be objective and we have to make sure that scientific principles are followed. Although I said I would not be technical, but I think just a basic understanding of some of the scientific principles, that why you could not just take any medicine or take somebody's say so. We need to establish certain parameters. And some of those parameters, just for digression, for understanding, one of the fundamental principles in microbiology and in establishing causation, as we called it, is what we call Koch's postulate. This was a German physician, 1890, which is that you must be able to establish that the causal agent and should be able to extract it, put it in pure culture and reinfect, and a process of understanding. The second thing that I want you to appreciate is the criteria that you would use in the lab. For example, apart from the Koch's postulate, you will also want to use a criteria which is followed from 1890 to the Bradford Hill criteria, which is again which is used in establishing the fact that smoking causes cancer. It's a postulation, and people were unbelievable that smoking could cause cancer, or the evidence for it. Over a number of years, a lot of issues were looked at in terms of this causation, which it basically means you have to be clear that you can replicate it and that you can, that it's also very, very well defined within the international scientific community. I think science is global, and I think it's important for us to understand within the context of this COVID-19 that the protocols have been established over a period of time, And this scientific methods and some of the issues that we follow is fairly objective. Another example that I want to give you is during the Olympics, when they do the drug tests on the athletes. We have various tests for looking at drugs in human systems, but basically when you take a sample from an athlete, if you divide the sample into 6 and send it to 6 laboratories across the world, using the same protocol, using the same scientific method, you'd be able to establish all 6 laboratories should come up with the same result. It's a fundamental principle in chemistry, fundamental principle in science. So there would be no what we call cultural factors. Those 6 laboratories, if they are well grounded in following the protocols, should come up with the same result. That is the fundamental basis of scientific research. And so when we follow the protocols, it should come with the same results. Unfortunately, politically, when people decide that they are not going to accept particular results, it's simply because of their lack of understanding of the science. And I think that has played itself out in this COVID-19 pandemic. That by and large, the WHO has been a steady influence, letting us know what is happening. The protocols have been established from the 2002-2004 SARS-1. And so when this came up, the protocols were indeed followed. But the difference of how we tackled SARS-1 is similar to how it was contained, that active cases were detected, we isolated those cases, contact tracing, which is the same as in the Ebola case, quarantine of all contacts, social distancing. Those were all the measures that allowed us to subdue SARS-1 between 2002 and 2004. So those were the same measures that were brought forward when COVID-19 came, looking at how we would look at difference. The difference, as I said earlier on, is that COVID-1, although the genome map is 86% similarity, COVID-19 is much more serious, much more deadly. And in the case of Nigeria, the index case was somebody coming from Italy who was infected. And again, given what I said about the experience of the Ministry of Health in Lagos and Lagos University Teaching Hospital, that they immediately swung into action and started to do the contact tracing. And of course, the difficulty is that where you don't follow the protocols, as people go about without knowing, and in systematic cases, they were spreading it. And by spreading it, of course, over a period of time, we've already established that the incubation period is about 14 days. So what was clear from the mapping from China in December 2019, it quickly spread as modern travel through airports suggested that obviously they were carrying it apart from the transmission that occurred. But clearly travel was instrumental. In the case of Lagos, Nigeria, it was that index case, traveling for a business meeting in Ogun State here, and that brought the case. And as I said, it's our preparedness. There are other issues that are coming up in terms of how different countries have been able to cope. And I think we will also be able to discuss some of that. But I think it's important to understand a bit of the reasoning, because it has shown that whilst we're prepared to a certain extent, to another extent, we're ill-prepared because we need to look at our health system that is non-existent. And that is really the key issue for us, that we're not prepared for this kind of pandemic. So we have a situation where you compare the UK road infrastructure and the US and other parts of the country that have the infrastructure. So as a result of the detection on the 30th of January 2020, WHO declared COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern. That's an epidemic. It's quite important that the language is that governments will then take cue as to what the status of particular pandemics are. So on the 30th of January, it was only a public health emergency of national concern. And by the 11th of March, declared that it's a pandemic which upgraded from an epidemic to epidemic because it's spread throughout the world. The issue for us is to just digress to again a bit of science. The viruses are different from bacteria, and it's important that you understand that bacteria are slightly larger and can reproduce themselves. Viruses need a host, and that host is important for the transmission. So some of the rules of social distancing is to stop the spread and to stop the contact, because obviously there are distribution from animal to human and human to human contact and various other aspects of that case. So that is why those decisions, once it's been declared a pandemic, airports were shut down. Some people were taking an earlier intervention, stopping movement. It's quite drastic to take these steps because we didn't have with SARS-1 or Ebola level of intervention, state intervention that we now have. But with us in West Africa is an ongoing battle, as I said, with the Lassa fever, that SARS now have COVID. But our health system is unable to cope. And the reason why it's unable to cope is that over a period of years since independence, we've underspent. We've not developed a system. It can't cope with ordinary situation, not to talk of a pandemic. And I think that is why intervention of WHO, donor agencies, all the other organizations actually assisted us. I think the most crucial intervention was actually from Jack Ma with the testing kit, because we didn't have any. So, and that's still one of our problems till today, is not doing the level of testing that they're doing in the UK. So that would be an issue for us. But if we just go through and come back to establishing the virus, establishing the number of cases. Today, 21st of June, as you can see from dashboard, we have over 8.8 million people infected throughout the world. We have 464,973 deaths across the world, and the figure is increasing on a daily basis. So just for the record, I heard about Brazil. The infection in the US is about 2.2 million. Brazil, over 1 million. In the UK, 304,000. In Nigeria, 19,800. Ghana, 13,700. In terms of deaths, in the US, 119,744,000 people. In Brazil, 49,000. In the UK, it's either 42,000, 56,000. Controversy that you add the deaths, all people's own to the figures. And the deaths so far in Nigeria is about 506, and in Ghana, about 85. So that is the toll and the reason for shutting down the lockdown, to try and prevent the spread of the virus. to areas that were previously clean, essentially. And since it came through Lagos, it has spread to all 36 states. And in a way, we've managed not very well, at least a lot of positive developments. But one of the sad parts of it is that we did not have enough laboratories to test. We did not have enough equipment. We did not have the PPEs or the agents. And in fact, when the outbreak came, there were only 2 testing laboratories in a whole country of 200 million people that could do the test. So almost all the tests were done in Abuja or Lagos. So that left room for people to doubt the efficacy, and they could not see some of the difference. So that from that setting up of the presidential task force, quickly accrediting laboratories, and up till today, we now have about 30 in 2 or 3 months. This is a remarkable development, given that we have not spent enough on our health or education over the last few years. And I think it's important that we bear that in mind, that if we are to take, first of all, come back to the health. On the health side, we are encouraged, if I can use that word, to spend at least 10% of our GDP on health development. We spend approximately 3.7%. There are countries that spend 15%, 20%, and 25%. So if you don't spend money on development, then you'll not be surprised that you're not able to cope. But it's not that we don't have the expertise. We do have the expertise. The real figure is that from the Nigerian Medical Association is that there are 30,000 doctors, members of the NMA, 30,000 doctors in Nigeria at present, as of today. But there are more than that outside of the country. So that you can see that the proportionality of the number of doctors to patients is wanting. And again, since we're talking about comparison between Nigeria and London and UK, there are 5,200 Nigerian doctors working in the NHS meritoriously. So the point being that most of the qualified health professionals have migrated to greener pastures in the US, in the UK, and various other places, simply because they're better paid, the facilities are better, and I think the current strike of the residential doctors is basically to do with not having the right apparatus, not having the right PPE, various other promised emoluments, which has not existed. But if you were a young doctor and you were able to get onto the NHS, you can double your salary times 20. So that, I think, is why we have to give credence and kudos to those that have remained behind, that fought against all the challenges, the deficit of power, equipment, drugs, and various other challenges that they've been complaining of for 40 years. And I think we just not done anything. And I think it's not surprising, because the people they're complaining to don't use the system, so they can't see the problems. So when the outbreak came and people could no longer fly out and they were forced to use the current facilities, they could not believe how bad the situation was. So I think that's an important consideration. The other issues that we have to bear in mind is that the figures that is quoted, that you can see the figures of both the infection and the death rate has been disproportionately high in those countries with the best facilities. So the US, UK, Italy, Spain, again, they have had planning. They've always planned for this kind of. But of course, I would just like to give one example, that in Italy, the particular area have been planning for such pandemics and have developed a 100-bed facility. That facility has not been used in 40 years since the war. So the very first time they're going to use the facility, the first set of bodies that were brought in, a 100-bed facility, suddenly 700 were brought in, totally unprecedented and totally beyond any scenario of preparation. That even when you prepare for something that has not happened for 40 years, and the moment it happens, you're overwhelmed, and even your facilities, your planning, really are unable to cope with the circumstances. And I think that what is also clear from the management of the process and the figures, because it's an ongoing work where we're looking at how the affected groups, and it's clearly affecting the 60 plus so far age group. And also there is a demographics of poor people being more affected for all the reasons in terms of nutrition and various other issues. The problem that we have in Nigeria when it broke out is that we still have those who do not believe in the process because the people have been less trustful of government over a number of years. And I think that we always have a phrase in Nigeria that we are our own local government, in the sense that if they don't provide light, you buy your generator, you provide your own light. If they don't provide water, you do a borehole and provide your own water. And you just manage through, essentially. So the distrust of government is at the heart of the distrust of the instruction to stay at home or not travel, because in a sense that we also have figures of Nigeria now being the poverty capital of the world. We moved into a situation where people are living less than $2 a day. That's the poverty level has gone up. So there are those issues that exacerbated our condition. So what we are compared to the UK is that whilst the UK is better funded and better prepared, there remains controversy even in the UK, and I'm sure those of you that are there will know that all is not well in terms of criticism of the way the government has handled the situation. I just want to quote the situation in the UK. For example, more than 32,000 people died in hospital and 16,000 died in care homes. The controversy was that whether you add the care homes to the hospital deaths, and I think that is part of the controversy. But the latest investigation showed that in the UK, in the 3 weeks between the 2nd and the 23rd of April, 26,566 people died. And so the issue was that the combination will be about 52,161 rather than the figure that you will see there in terms of number of deaths in the United Kingdom, 42,474. The reason why that was challenged, and it was challenged by the former chief scientific advisor, describing the UK figures as the worst in Europe. Sir David King said, and I want to quote, he said they were saying things that were more rosy than they actually are. The most important thing when you're running a crisis of this kind is truth and honesty. The only way to maintain the moral authority of the government. He said this is the most disastrous handling of any serious challenge to a UK government in 100 years. Now, those are big words from a respected figure. And I think, again, when I was looking at that quote about honesty and truthfulness, and they were describing things more rosy than they are. I think almost all governments are guilty of this. And I think when the research is done, where of the UK, the US, various other places, almost all governments were downplaying the figures, but it was just unbelievable. So the figure and the challenge to the UK figures that is actually 64% higher than they're quoting. So again, that's where the controversy lies. And as I said, in Europe, uh, the UK overtook Spain and Italy, and but you also have to give credit for the transparency that it was announced when Prince Charles had uh, contacted the disease. It was public knowledge. When the Prime Minister contacted it, it was public knowledge and went to use the public facility, and various other initiatives that one would say is actually quite admirable in the honesty and truthfulness that Sir David was talking about. I think it's important that to send a message to the average person that this COVID-19 is not a respecter of class, age, or wealth, and in fact, those the actual people that were affected were the people that traveled about and were able to have contact with some of those issues. In fact, you might argue that they brought the disease into the community that was then allowed to spread. So that, I think, uh, is important. I think once you've had the shutdown, and we've mentioned our inability to provide our health system with the necessary facilities, I think we need to go back to education. I think this is an important aspect because once the COVID pandemic was declared and the issue of social distancing, schools were closed and remained closed majority parts of the because you wanted to stop the spread. Because since this disease was not affecting young people in the sense of it, it was important that they could be carriers taking it to their parents and grandparents. So that was the reason for schools being shut. 1.6 billion children uh, not in school as a result of this pandemic. But if we look at our pre-COVID situation in Nigeria, uh, we need to put a mirror to ourselves. And the mirror is that we know, and I think I like to recall His Excellency Prince Gbajabiamila, who was the Nigerian ambassador to the UK. He had been the Minister of Justice, Attorney General, and also served in the World Court at The Hague as a judge from Nigeria. And he said that in his international service, it was always common that they would refer to Nigeria as a place where we don't care about education. We have the largest number of children out of school. This is an important statistics. That 20% of children out of school in the whole world are in Nigeria. And that has meant that even pre-COVID, a lot of our children are wandering the streets, selling pure water, not even accessing schools at all. And I think that has been UNESCO, we've been encouraging us over the last 40 years that no other top 10 oil producer should be in this position. And the two positions that they were mentioning to us is our education system and our health system. We have the highest infant mortality. Nigeria is the worst place to give birth. A lot of our women died in childbirth. It's not improved, the figures are poor. And our children are not going to school, essentially. We've not provided for them the way we should, given as a top 10 oil producer. And we were saying that what lessons have we learned, or what lessons can we learn? A situation when our main 90% of our income is from oil. And when we had oil at $120 a barrel, we did not do anything. So is it $15 to the barrel that we have the ability to actually have that intervention? But going back to the education system, that we have 20% of children out of school in the whole world right now. So they're not even accessing the education, and it's only 20-30% that goes on from primary to secondary, and at university level, it's only about less than 10%. So it's an unequal society, and we've not ever had to do the intervention that's needed. And the decline is traced to the military level, because after all, as I said, this 30,000 or more that are outside of the country were actually trained here, working successfully in various countries. And I think when you look at website of Nigerian neurosurgeons in the US, there are more Nigerian neurosurgeons in the US than are in Nigeria. So you will look at where they qualified, and most of them qualified in big institutions, University of Ife, University of Nsukka, Adobelo University, various other. So in a sense, when the right intervention financially was there, then the progress was made. But since we've not put the money in, there's been difficulty for us to progress. And I think the second one that I want to also mention when we look at our decline is to compare ourselves to Ghana. Ghana is our neighboring country, our great rival in football, various other things. For the first 40 years, most of the Ghanaian students came to Nigerian universities. We dominate the region, and the situation has been that we have two comparators. For West African exams, West African exam is a regional exam taken by students from across the region. So you have data over a period of 40 years plus. So you can know how children have been progressing through their schooling and their success rate. Now, the situation is that in the first 30 years, it was the privilege that the best 100 students were the students from Nigeria and the big elite secondary schools. But over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a drastic change. And the drastic change, as some of my Nigerian colleagues, is that some of the top 100 students were mainly from Ghana in what they called secondary schools you've never heard of, in Ashimota College, or we looked at secondary schools in Bijan and various other areas. And the first time it happened, Nigerian parents and Nigerian teachers said it was a fluke, that in the sense that Ghana were lucky this time. It's like almost like a football. If you've been winning for the last 30 years and suddenly somebody beats you, and then you wonder how well it couldn't happen. It's the children, not the right ones at this time. But the clear answer and the clear thing that I want to draw out is that subsequently and up till today, the Ghanaian youngsters outperformed the Nigerian students consistently over the last 10, 15 years. Now, would there have been a lot of investigations and lots of reasons, but the clear answer is there. The clear answer is that UNESCO asked nations to spend at least 25% of their GDP on education. And of course, if you know the history of our relationship with Ghana, stability. Ghana is the only country in Africa that spends 25% on education. We spend less than 10%. So you can imagine having a better team, better prepared. They have celebrated 5 years of uninterrupted light. Their public secondary schools have running water and running water. And their preparedness for the West African exam is second to none, and it's reflected in their pass rates. So that is one area that we would fall behind if we don't spend the money to educate our children. And this is different from the issue of children being on the street. The second one I want to draw a comparison with, again, like the West African examinations, is what we call the West African Surgeons exam. This is, again, a regional exam taken by doctors across the range. By and large, because of our size, the size of Nigeria, most of the people who mark this exams are Nigerians, and they have always dominated the West African Surgeons exam. But again, suddenly, over the last 10 years, University of Legon, University of Ghana, and various other universities have more than overtaken Nigerian universities. And again, the irony, as I said, the markers and the examiners are by and large Nigerian. So that is also to send a signal to us that our system is failing. We have not contributed to health and not to education. So what have we contributed to? And I think those are the remarkable progress that our neighbors have made. It's also reflected in the tertiary education system in universities. As I said before, Nigeria, West Africa, the Nigerian university system has been one of the best in Africa. We gave scholarship to students from Namibia, Zimbabwe. We supported the struggle in South Africa, Botswana, and various other places. And Ghana, they came to Nigerian system. So over the period of time, they spent the money, as I said, on developing their own system. As a result, Ghana is now a destination for Nigerian students. And I think that's, again, another statistics that I want to put forward to you. There are 78,000 Nigerian students in Ghana paying in dollars. Now, that amount being spent by Nigerian parents, going back to my earlier vision that Nigerian parents are not waiting on government to educate their children. They will do it themselves as best as they can. So this 78,000 students by their parents are funding the awards education in the Ghana education system. The result of that is that the budget, the amount of money those parents are spending, is bigger than the federal budget for education for federal universities. That, I think, again, illustrates the extent of our problem. We have underfunded the system. As a result, as we're talking, the Nigerian university system are on the strike again. Again, the reason for distrust of government is that when I mentioned the Ebola 2014, they were on strike. COVID 2019, they're on strike because government will sign agreement with, some of these agreements go back to 20 years, and they've never fulfill any of the agreements. So there'll be one in strike trying to get different governments to comply with signed agreement, and it will not. So there's a disruption in the education of those children pre-COVID-19. That remains the case. Those are challenges before us. This meeting is what I would call a family meeting in which we can speak frankly to each other. It just happens that we have guests listening in from other parts of the world. But I think the facts are speaking for themselves, and I think we should say them in the hope that the lessons we've learned will lead to improvement of our systems for the benefit of our children and for the benefit of our women in terms of healthcare. I mean, it's clearly our health system has been exposed. The fragility is clear. We don't have enough bed spaces, and we have made some progress, but mainly through donation from the various countries, the EU, the UK, the US, the NGO. They've come to support us for us to spend the money in the right way because of our size as a country of 200 million people, giants in Africa. We have been on many United Nations peace mission. As a regional stability, we are having to not allow Nigeria to go down in terms of having to deal with some of these issues. We will hope and pray that some of the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19 and the exposure of our system, or lack of it, would allow us to improve. The issue of prediction as to, so there's some questions that I'm sure people will want to have answered, in that, as I said, this COVID-19 has been more serious than predicted. Normally, we have mathematical models for predicting diseases to look at how you would have a prediction of what is likely to happen based on the data that you have to see what will happen. And as I said before, some of these models have failed to work. And clearly, in some of the areas where, as I mentioned earlier on, where they have the best facilities, the best intervention, they're least able to cope. The research should also be, why has Africa been less affected so far? And I think those are questions to be answered. There's some reasons, there's some speculation as to why we've not been affected is simply because the most of the people that have died statistically are the over 60s, over 70s, and Africa generally has a younger population. But there are people who beat the particular model or outside of the model. Heard about a baby dying, youngest people dying, which are not in the model essentially. And we've had cases of somebody over 100 recovering, which again, statistically or according to the model, that's not been so. Well, what has happened is that the COVID-19 has devastated the hospitality and the aviation and various industries, and have had a catastrophic effect on education. As I said, 1.6 billion people in 200 countries are affected by and again, the issue of children out of school. And again, when I think about our own family history, about these children out of school, then I find that our grandfather and great-grandfather in the 1920s were concerned about children out of school and children roaming about, and they did something in forming the Ansarudin group to provide schools for those who didn't have the opportunity. I mean, those things, when you look back, they wouldn't imagine that in 2020 we will still be talking about children out of school. And I think that those issues are some of the things we have to look at. And the other issue is that the impact has been more on the poor and vulnerable groups. The example of Ebola that I've mentioned in Syria alone, schools were shut for 8 to 9 months. What happened there is that fewer of those children returned to school. Most of them entered the work market because most of the parents are poor, and sometimes they're dependent on children, child workers, and bringing an income in. And they've suddenly seen the vulnerability of somebody being out of school for so long. The other outcomes from, again, the experience of Ebola in West Africa is that by being out of school for 8 to 9 months, most of those children have forgotten what they've been taught, and it's been very difficult for them to adjust. The difference between 2002, 2014, and now is increasingly the availability of online learning to support students so that they'd not be out of school for so long. But we must argue here that in our case, in Nigeria, with not having an electrical supply, it's been difficult for the poor people in the rural area to even have access to the online, even the radio and the television schools that have been provided. So invariably, we would expect less of those children to return. What worries me is that if we already have 20% of children out of school in the whole world, in Nigeria already, post-COVID-19, that is likely to get worse unless the government does something. That is really an issue. One of the other outcomes of this COVID-19 is being the family relationships that we find, which is, again, almost throughout the world, but more or less exacerbated in Africa. There have been a lot of gender-based violence, attack on children, child abuse, and various other things that's almost unbelievable. In the case of South Africa, the Prime Minister, Cyril Ramaphosa, went on television to actually apologize to the nation that the violence that is being meted on their women and their children is unprecedented. It is something that, again, they need to look at. But it's not the South Africa experience. It's not different from the West African sub-region as well. We have had cases, history, high-profile murder cases of rape and children being killed. It's a case in Jos. It's a case in Ebola. 2 cases in the Barracks. And so there are a number of that increased violence against women and children as a result of this lockdown, COVID. And I think that is an issue for us. The other issue, of course, is being governance, the relationship between the population and the governments. the governance in terms of the lockdown and some erratic decision and behavior by some of the state governments. It's also underscore an exacerbated problem. So we have situations where the federal would issue a directive that there should be a lockdown, that all testing would be in accredited laboratory, and that the cases of the protocols should be followed. And you will have the medical director who go, or the commissioner for health will go to the governor and say, these are the number of cases that we have. And the governor will say, it's the work of my enemies. I declare no COVID-19 in my state against the fact of evidence. Again, that is unfortunate because by such pronouncement, it has made the case worse because the transmission was allowed to carry on whilst the governors are down. The other issue is the way we have treated children. Given that the lockdown was to prevent community transmission, given that the lockdown was to try and isolate the virus, then some governors then decided they were going to deport children to other parts of the country. Now, you now take children out of the streets and deport them somewhere else. They already are infected, and you take the infection somewhere else. So that, I think, has consequences for us. And I think that we used to deride the UK Children's Act 1954 and subsequent amendments invested the strength and the power above parents to the state. And the Children's Act in the UK allows the government or the state government to take children into care due to bad parenting. And we have always said that it's un-African, that we believe that we are the care of our children, the best care of our children. And suddenly, this pandemic, this and the ones before, has shown that some parents are irresponsible in the sense that they clamor for a Child Right Act, and of course, rights to protect our women as well, because suddenly you can't, the normal system of protection of women and children are breaking down. So again, that's an issue for us to consider when we compare UK and Nigeria. But the impact on families and communities is a real one, and it's something that we have to bear in mind. Because I mentioned before, 99% of our income is from oil, and oil has crashed. Oil price has crashed. That we now have the landing cost about $30 a barrel, and we cannot sell it at $15 a barrel. So that's why we're borrowing left, right, and center, simply because the system and the center cannot hold. So the factors or the effect of this is that we will have increased poverty. We already are the status is always increased in terms of the poverty, but also we have security challenges. And again, that given COVID-19 is like a double whammy. That's trying to cope. And the kind of mortalities of what we are getting is making it difficult for us to cope. For example, the issue of ventilators. We only have about 500 ventilators for a population of 200 million plus. Again, as a result of this, increased spending in trying to address those issues. And I think also the issue of equipment, which again is similar in the UK, which is quite surprising. That there were medical associations were saying that the equipment and essentially the PPEs were in short supply simply because the extent of the problem, that the manufacturers could not cope. For example, the main manufacturer of the N95, the medical grade face mask, suddenly their normal run is about 1 million, 2 million in a year production. And suddenly their first order post-COVID-19 is 50 million. So there's no way even running the factory 24 hours that they could keep up. So that has been slow. The other factors we have to consider in relation to ourselves is that the other diseases, as a result of COVID-19, the other diseases have been neglected. So the impact on HIV, for example, would be great. Again, in relation to the UK, Cancer Care estimates that 60 million people will be vulnerable because there isn't enough resources to go around. There's an increase in kidney diseases, delayed transplant surgery. Cholera could make a comeback simply because we are exposed to that pandemic. As I said, in Nigeria, we have HIV cases, TB, cholera, malaria. We're entering the malaria season. COVID-19 has similarities to some of the symptoms, but in a sense, it's a case of how we're able to cope. The impact on our health system is that the latest figure that I have from NMA is that less than 20% of the population actually access the health system, conventional health system. Almost 80% patronizing any other means to survive simply because of financial ability to survive. So those are the kind of challenges that we now have to have. Suddenly with this pandemic, so far there are no exact cure. There are a number of candidates in terms of what we need. So we have that distortion of the medical care, the issue of increases in suicide, alcoholism, and democratization of poor systems being overstretched. The concept, in fact, one of the reasons that in Nigeria that the population are not obeying the lockdown rules is because of what they see and say that the hunger virus is actually a more deadlier one than the COVID-19, because most of the people, the artisans, work on a daily basis and earn their money to be able to survive. But it's very, very difficult on the lockdown. Whilst in the UK, there were palliatives, there were government interventions, there were interventions from government, the furlough, not to sack people, to allow the system to carry on. Those palliatives here is almost non-existent. I think that's the issue why those people do not trust the government. What they would find is that there would be a kind of a show where somebody would just go to a place, film a few people, and that's the last of it. There have been white report that they're not clear of who's getting this palliative. So it was one of the pressures on government to release, to lift the lockdown in the hope that you'll have a situation that people can return to work. Simply because you have no process in place, a robust process, a transparent process in place to actually offer those palliatives. But in fact, most people are depending on their families to be able to survive. So that, I think, is the issue at the moment. The issue of treatment of the COVID-19, again, is a work in progress. There have been a number of claims, most of it false. There's no vaccine as yet. There are a number of candidates, and there are a number of trials that the WHO is coordinating. We have the solidarity trials, which again is looking at different methods in different countries as part of it. There are various other interventions. For example, I know that the UK government gave the Oxford team over 200 million, and also the team, those teams to try and develop a vaccine. And there are a number of development that they've made that the world is awaiting the outcome, essentially. And then, of course, the recovery trial. Last week it was announced, the Oxford University reported that a steroid, dexamethasone, is has a significant reduction in mortality in patients that are already on ventilators or advanced stage of COVID-19. That is a treatment that, again, is hopeful and is quite cheering news. It doesn't prevent, but at least the survival rate. They talked about significant reduction in mortality. The figures are not touching, but it's actually being championed as a way forward in reducing the mortality. There are other trials that are going on. The one that the Americans are doing, again, the remdesivir, which is an antiviral drug which was used to treat Ebola, is also being evaluated against COVID-19. There are interferon beta trials. There have been, again, unfortunate suggestions by some governments, which has almost derailed the whole process because everybody was looking for an answer. And in a sense that it's reached the lowest ebb when it was suggested that Dettol would be a disinfectant consumed could wipe out the virus. And I think it's just basically not understanding the science, as I mentioned earlier on. But there are a number of viruses that are at an advanced stage in trials. The Oxford trials have two important vaccines on the trial, the CoV-001 and CoV-002. They've been evaluated to see whether provide the vaccine. The vaccine is the most desirable option for the size of the population. The idea that people could have a drink, number of myths that, again, if you go to the website of WHO and even the Nigerian CDC, just to avoid the fake news. And I think it's one of the outcomes of this pandemic, that people will spread fake news, which has led to people's death because of the wrong information. And of course, there is a wider movement that has latched on to either see it as another tool of war, anti-vaccine, anti-government, the idea that it's a conspiracy. So those are all challenges that is coming in as we try to navigate our way through the COVID-19. But all we can do is make predictions, and we pray that something is done about it. And I think, as I said, some of the predictions, as I said, is that there will be greater deaths from childbirth because women are vulnerable and the system cannot cope. The system that could not cope before COVID-19 will find it difficult to cope. There will be further pressure on girl-child education. This is an important issue in our part of it, that we find it very, very difficult to equate the brilliance of our female child, the fact that the girl-child education has been something that we've not encouraged. But in a sense, in the last few years, 15 to 20 years, the girl child and women subsequently demonstrated their worth. And almost all over the world go to various convocations. It is the girls that are doing very well. Again, in relation to our own particular university, Crescent University, Abeokuta, over the last 15 years, most of our first-class students have been the female students. Most of best graduating students. So when we give them the opportunity and chance, they're likely to do very, very well. But our problem is that as a result of this COVID-19, that we may not return to education because sometimes the family pressure, poverty, would allow take that pressure that I mentioned earlier on. And as I said, if we are not careful, the increase in child abuse and rape would also continue, as we've heard in terms of the intervention that South Africa has done with the president going on television to actually physically apologize and acknowledge the problem. And that if we ourselves take that very, very seriously, because we're in a precarious position, precarious situation where the price of oil has gone down, our main commodity, our support structure is almost collapsing, and in the sense that the security challenges, we have challenges in education, and challenges in health. So in the case of the university system, as I said, it's still on strike because they've not been able to pay people. And as a result, we have lost brilliant academics all over the world. And in the sense that that has allowed us to struggle. But we hope and pray that the lessons learned from this pandemic is a renaissance of the nation. Also, a memory of Dr. Saladeh for what she did in the case of Ebola. We were extremely lucky that we didn't have the kind of pandemic, an epidemic that occurred in Syria and Guinea. 11,000 people died, and in terms of Nigeria, I think less than 20 died. So the fire next time is that COVID-19 is only one of several viruses. There are others, at least 800 all over the place, but not all harmful, not all that have led to epidemic. But it means that you have to have infrastructure, you have to have trained personnel, you have to encourage your local people to develop that skill that is needed. Universities are skill acquiring institutions. So if you don't pay the lecturers very well, as I said, I've compared ourselves with Ghana, where Ghana spends 25% of GDP on education. We spend less than 10%. They've overtaken us in terms of educational performance. They're better prepared. And in fact, when you look at the figure for this COVID-19, I would hazard a guess that Ghana has actually performed much better. And when I look at some of their facilities and their readiness with PPE, we have to credit them for that. I mean, we would argue that in terms of size, it's quite a small population compared to us, but at least in focusing their mega resources on education and health, it's pointed to us. And as I said, I would also argue that Nigeria is the best developer of Ghana's tertiary education and health systems. As I said, 78,000 Nigerian students, Ghana paying in dollars, and most of the lecturers in some of the Ghanaian universities and in their health systems are Nigerians. So in a sense, there is a more conducive environment. And of course, as I said, that whilst our doctors are performing operations dark or using touchlight, Ghana has celebrated 5 years for an uninterrupted life. So lessons that we've learned from this pandemic, and as I said, is an ongoing problem, ongoing issue. That the reason for this meeting, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, that we are putting a mirror to ourselves, looking to improve our circumstances and the circumstances of children. And I think the figures are there. We should not see it as I said, some of the governors will suppress the figures of their positive cases and declare that there is no COVID-19 in their state, when clearly there's the case, or say that it's not COVID-19, but it's a mysterious death. So all these things are diversional. In fact, it wouldn't be funny if people were dying. Those are issues before us, and I think that we as a nation should re-examine ourselves, look at how other people have coped, and we should not rely on donations. We have to keep reminding ourselves that we're a top 10 oil producer, in the sense that we had the money, have the ability to be able to make that intervention seriously. It may well be that maybe if pro-Ghana in terms of what we've done, one is just being objective. That's why I said that when you compare the West African exam and the West African Surgeons exam, you can see their performance. But having said all of that, I think that they still can't beat us at football. Jollof rice is nothing to write home about. So I think they have a lot to be proud of. And I'd like to round off there and hopefully take some of the issues from other people from the question and answer session. I want to thank the association for inviting me. As I said, they last invited me 15 years ago, and it's a small meeting compared to what we had today. But we're in an unprecedented time, and technology allows colleagues from different parts of the world to join us, colleagues from India and Malaysia, USA, South Africa, and various other places, to at least see what some of our issues and what lessons we can learn. And of course, the academic community, of course, our students who have been quite magnificent in trying to navigate their way through. I also want to thank all the people at Present University for their support in the state, the Ake of Ibrahim, Olota Balani, Pro-Chancellor, Naji Damo, the Emir of Kazuri, the Chancellor, Alafo, and of course the proprietor and founder, His Excellency Prince Bolaji Solo Alama Broker.
As an underview and oversight, we recognize the presence of everyone who's been there from across the world. Unfortunately, we cannot keep listing your names. If we do, we are going to run out of time, and we will not be able to proceed with the question and answer session. However, we do appreciate you joining us, and we do give you the honor that is due to you. Professor Gbajabiamila, before we move to the questions, I have a general observation and some feedback for you. If you look at the picture on the screen, that is from Olabisi Onabanjo University in, I think, Abeokuta or Ijebu, somewhere around there. They said they have a herbal syrup for COVID-19, and that's the package that is currently circulating on the internet. What is your view on that before we move to the questions? Because I have some questions for you already.
Yes, I think
and I'm not sure whether you've seen it as
it's
well.
It's not a cure. What you have is that obviously the issue of vitamins, nutrition, and various other things that you could use to prevent or slow down the infection. I think we must be careful that if somebody markets a vitamin-based drink as a kind of thing that you would take to better boost your immune system, and I think that's what they are. They boost your immune system, not a cure. And I think it's erroneous to call it anti-COVID-19, but nonetheless, we have to be careful. It's not a cure, and I think it can be a misrepresentation by putting the virus picture there. Because, for example, if we know that hand washing and sanitizing, you could also claim that they are anti-COVID-19 because they do prevent the spread of the virus. So ordinary soap could be deemed similarly. But what we are talking about is actual cure and prevention, evidence-based, supported evidence, not, as I said, some of this issue. I'm not against any preparation. I always say is that they should be evaluated for their efficacy and to show that they are useful in that purpose. I think you would, again, if you've been following the task force here, the Minister of Health asks people to submit all their candidates for cure and intervention. And in a sense that only 3 passed through the first stage, despite over 200 people going to the media saying they've got a cure. And again, the protocol, as the minister said, is that when people were asked to write down the process, because they've not done any work apart from anecdotal, they were unable to actually even do that. So some of them said, well, just give me the COVID patient and I will return them cured, rather than having a protocol. And the minister said, well, you cannot expose people to any danger because the person that is claiming this has not provided any evidence. So those are the issues. I think that would be my answer to that.
Thank you very much, Professor Gbajabiamila. Some of our listeners have sent in questions, and I think we'll start from that before we now open it up to the audience. The first question is this: what lessons can we learn from the pandemic that we can teach to young Muslims, both in Nigeria and worldwide?
Well, I think first of all, I think to know that there is a history to the pandemics, and that as some of the figures that I quote earlier on, the 1918 flu epidemic, and going back to some of the earlier ones, smallpox, and others that have been more devastating. The Great London pandemic wiped out 20% population of London, the Black Death, and various other things. So I think, first of all, the history is very, very important. We need to concentrate on the STEM subjects to allow more of our children to be trained in science and technology so that they can contribute to some of this development. And I've seen some of the universities have fabricated ventilators, fabricated hand washing facilities as a result of this pandemic, simply because we don't have the currency or the ability to import more of these facilities.
Okay, thank you very much for the response to that, and I hope the questioner has heard the answer to that. Now, when you were discussing, you talked about a method of analysis of samples, and then you said you used the athletes as your case study. That when you take samples from athletes, you send it to 6 different laboratories, and hopefully you hope to get the same result.
Absolutely.
Now, in the news recently, I think it was in Congo or in Burundi, the president of that country was trying to disprove the existence of COVID-19. And he took samples from pawpaw, from sheep, from cow, and I think from a car. And he sent it to the lab. And the result came back and they said those things have COVID-19. And the president said, hang on a minute. How can pawpaw, how can a cow, how can engine oil from a car have COVID-19? What can you say about that?
Yes, I think the issue has not invalidated the process. There are some rapid testing kits that have been again evaluated to be not useful because they're giving false positives, and that's a common event. False positive. That's why our government said that it must be an accredited laboratory, and that it is those laboratories that are following the protocol. So you have to ensure that the laboratories are able to follow the standard protocol. You will get false positive in anything if you are compromising either the competence of the technician or the competence of the process. So to me, that has not invalidated the scientific principle. Because what you also do is that you test and test and test again. So in a sense that we now have, let's say, 30 laboratories. If we're able to develop competence and centralized system, we can have that expertise to develop the test and to ensure the standardization. What has been difficult, and again, if you look at the problem we had in Kano, they were overwhelmed, and some of the laboratories were not accredited to actually do the work. So that issue of accreditation is very, very important. I think some of these presidents, again, as I say, my contention is that they don't understand the science. Sometimes they've politicized the whole issue. And we've had situations where any criticism is seen as a political intervention or personal criticism, whereas what we're saying is that people are dying and we have to provide them with the best care. So we can't ignore the evidence and say, oh, that's not the case. Or, as I said, the governor would overrule a medical director saying that we have 36 cases and the governor said, I've reduced it to 0. I asked the Commissioner for Information to announce 0 when the medical director said it's 36. So those are the kind of comedy.
Thank you very much, sir, for your response. In addition to that, how has COVID-19 and the lockdown changed the world's most populated cities like Lagos, Oyo, Ibadan, and Ogun State?
I think it has had an effect, a great effect, because as I said, that it's a combination of a number of factors. At a time when 90% of the population are depending on their daily bread, as it were, having a lockdown with no palliatives, it just means that the hunger set in because there's no basis in which you can sustain the size of the population. And as I said, we've exhausted our reserves. Our main commodity is unsaleable, and very difficult for us to actually support them in the way that they've been supported in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. You talked about us spending less than the Nigerian government spending less than 25% of their GDP on education.
Yes.
But as early as last week in the news, ASU said that is, I think ASU is Association of Senior Staff of Nigerian Universities.
Yes,
They
that's right.
said they will kick against online teaching in Nigeria, and they will encourage all their members to support that online teaching does not exist in Nigeria. What is your response to this, and what is your advice to the government and to ASU?
I think you have to bear in mind that we're in an industrial dispute situation where before the pandemic, the ASU, the main trade union body, are on strike because of the government not fulfilling previous agreements on the emoluments of the lecturers. So that is an issue. So it's an extension of boycotting classes or boycotting the universities. I think we as a private universities have been teaching online. I think the issue isn't about boycotting. They're boycotting period because of the industrial action. And of course, the resident doctors, similarly, over the last week have been on strike again for some of these reasons and trying to resolve it. And I think as of tomorrow, the suspension of that strike will come into place, whilst the government will now have to fund adequately. So the end justifies the means.
Thank you very much. So we just have to fold our hands and wait for what happened. Now, when you were talking earlier, you said something about
to fold our hand. I think we as a citizen and as parents, we have rights to say that our children should be better educated, that our women should be better supported. I think we can't fold our hands. I mean, that's the beauty of democracy. If once people have the information, as we've seen, people are outraged by the murder of Barakat, the rape and the violence against children. Parents are outraged. People have gone out into the street and protested. So they can't fold their hand. I think the issue is that when good people fold their hands, then whatever happens, those that are able to speak out for the oppressed, those who are able to speak out for the downtrodden, those who are able to speak out for those that have been denied those opportunities, then that would encourage people not to fold their hand. I think by folding our hand is how we've got to where we are today, and that's why we've allowed 20% of children out of school, that we've not spent enough money on early child education, we've not spent enough money on the health system. And I keep repeating that 78,000 students in Ghana alone, and again, maybe more than that in South Africa, more than that in the UK and the US, and spread all over the world, Malaysia, Singapore. So simply because the capacity of our university, we have 3 million plus children sitting JAM entrance exam, but the total carrying capacity of the Nigerian system, both private, public, and state, is only 450,000. So you have more than 1 million, 2 million looking for space that is non-existent. That is our challenge. That's a failure of planning. So people go elsewhere. And unfortunately, some of them are driven to neighboring countries which have standards that even below ourselves, simply because parents want to access education for their own. So that is what has resulted in our folding of our hands. And I dare say that if those parents were able to spend the money in the Nigerian system, we would return to the glory days of University of Ibadan. At independence, was rated as one of the best universities in the Commonwealth, and the hospital was highly rated. I think at this point we want to pay a tribute to the demise of the late great Nigerian scientist that died this week. Again, a stalwart of the Ibadan connection and excellence. Of course, Ife, various other Nsukka, and Amadu Bello University.
Thank you very much, Prof. Still on the Nigerian system, I've just learned a new term now, which is Nigerian factor. And then the question is this. When you were discussing earlier, you showed us the figures from UK and elsewhere, and those figures are, within scientific reason, very accurate. However, in Nigeria, He said, what are the factors hindering against transparency in the reporting of the infection rate in Nigeria? For instance, the minister will say it's 10, the news will say it's 50. When you tune to another station, he will say it's 200. When you ask the local populace, they say no, it's nothing. So why don't we have transparency in Nigeria?
Well, I think that is, again, for the same reasons that Sir David King in the UK mentioned that most governments have played down the seriousness of the situation. But in our particular case, is that we are reticent in the sense that the consequence of that lockdown in some of those states would mean that the fragility of the system and the undermining of that. But as a nation, we cannot play local politics. We've got to protect across the range by having standardized protocols. So I think that is what has made it difficult. We've tried to, the task force has done a great job in trying to centralize the system, that they're the only reporting body, the only reliable figure that you get is from them. But the issue of underreporting can never be ruled out. But the other reason is that we're not testing enough. That's the real crux of the matter. The UK has ramped up to do 100,000 tests a day. In 3 months, we've only done about 100,000. So the increased figure is due to that community spreading, because we didn't have the facilities, we didn't have the laboratories, as I said. We only started with 2 laboratories at the beginning of the pandemic. We now have 30. We didn't have the ingredients for the testing, apart from that magnificent donation by the So we are now behind. But of course, the more you're testing, the more you're finding. That is the reality. The more you're doing the community testing, the more you're finding. So the figures are likely to go up over the next few weeks. That is why it's very difficult to open up completely, especially the schools and various other places. And also, willful disobedience of social distancing, wearing of masks. And I think that, again, just to look at the Nigerian condition, when during Ramadan, they said that there would be no Eid, Mecca and various other places, so again, for all those reasons, everybody accepted that. But there were mavericks, even here in Ogun State, that still had congregational prayer, the Eid prayer, against scientific advice. So I think it's for those scholars, Islamic scholars, to understand, or to at least help us to explain the situation where even using the Quran and a diktat that the Quran says that the government, whatever the government where you are, you follow through. There are a number of examples that the Sultan gave, issuing the directive, and also Mecca. So all of these respected bodies advised that there should be no Eid to avoid the spread. Now, of course, invariably and inevitably, there will be those spread as a result of those congregational prayers. That, I think, is unfortunate criminal act, because you jeopardize the Jamal by actually being defiant, trying to carry on regardless of that spread.
Thank you very much, sir. And the final question before we now round off for today is this. So the question is, what is your advice to, i.e., the Nigerian government, Muslims in Nigeria, the entire world, on COVID-19 and education, in spite of the fact that in Nigeria, for example, some of the people who are placed in isolation centers, they are having parties and having fun, and they said nothing's wrong with them. Some of them have been there for weeks and they have nothing is wrong with them. Some of them even go home in the night and come back in the morning. So what is your advice to them, sir?
Well, the issue of compliance and disregard of those rules is part of the problem, because it would increase the community spread. Again, as I mentioned, the comparison with the UK is that the transparency was there when Prince Charles was infected, and said the Prime Minister. People felt that, well, if the Prime Minister can get it, then it's possible for me to do it. Whereas in our case, it becomes an issue of secrecy. So the other issue is that we're very skeptical of government. So some people will say, well, if I've not seen anybody dying, then COVID-19 doesn't exist. That could be a bare parlor or anecdotal. But when the evidence that you see yourself on a daily basis from the charts that you've seen from the John Hopkins, that people are dying all over the world, and you then turn around and say, well, it's not happening. So I don't know what else needs to happen for you to say that. But in the cases of those that have willfully disregarded, it's simply because we have useful exuberance. For example, I've had people say that it's an old people's disease, it's a rich person's disease. That it's those people that are traveling on airports that are happening. Most people dying are over 60, 70. So somebody who is in their 20s will say, well, I'm not affected. As a result, I can go and play football or go to a party, as you say. I think that is very dangerous because you're exposing people to those dangers. I think we have a duty of care, and that duty of care was to prevent the population from being infected. I think the situation in India, various other places are similar, where the military police have been used to make sure that the condom is respected. But I think there have been different areas. I remember the mayor of New York saying that he was going to call federal troops in because of willful disregard in Central Park. That it was a nice, fine day, summer day, and there were people all over the park spreading it, as it were, and the total defiance of the order. So I think there's been that all over the world. But I think in our particular case, there's a poverty element, that most of those people need to work to be able to earn a living. There were no palliatives. And if you were an artisan, you would have to feed your family. You would disregard, because you say, well, if COVID-19 doesn't kill you first, then hunger virus will kill you. So that is the reason for some of them. So I think the advice is that it's a work in progress. We have to learn more and obey more, because the consequence is horrendous. As I said to you, in Italy, 100-bed facility has been overrun with 700 beds. We saw, videos of people on stretchers on the floor. Again, things that I've not heard of in modern NHS. The rapid response in building the Nightingale hospital, we have not added any more than what the private sector have added. So we have a lot to do to catch up. I think our prayer is that going forward, we will spend more on education, more and more on health to protect our population. And the parents, I think, will demand more as well, because the knowledge is clear that folding your hand would mean that you are not preparing your children for the future.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, those questions just came in while you were talking. They said, do you foresee another lockdown?
Well, you can't rule anything out. But what is clear in the pattern of this pandemic is that if you release people early, there will be a spike. And the result has happened in China. Areas that were previously declared safe in Wuhan, just this week, they were reinfected in the market. One of the things that is unusual with this COVID-19 is that if you've had it once, you can get it again. Unlike measles and yellow fever and various other things, you're immune subsequently. So if you disregard and you declare an area safe and somebody reintroduces it, then there will be further catastrophes. And if you don't do anything about it, then the bodies will start to come. And that is the difficulty. I think that the reason for reluctance in opening up is to avoid a second lockdown. But people have been talking about a second wave, but we're not even halfway through the first wave yet. But when you look at the previous pandemics, that's why I'm saying that if you look at Ebola, if you look at Lassa fever, if you look at SARS-1, if you look at the lessons from that is that they can re-emerge. The Ebola was 1976 in Democratic Republic of Congo, re-emerged in West Africa in 2014. SARS-1 between 2002 and 2004, re-emerged again in 2018. Lassa fever, the same. So the viruses are not going to go away. The mutations is a preparedness. I think nobody can say hand on heart that that's the end of it. It took years and years to eradicate polio, smallpox, and various other. So I think that if we don't take on board the measures and allow a free for all, then of course you would have to reinfect. In fact, there will be self-imposed lockdown because people would not want to go out into the wider community to actually manage the disease.
Thank you very much, sir. We are very grateful for your input and for the time you have taken out for us out of your very busy schedule to come and talk to us. And we have also benefited so much from your intellectual armory. Let us recite Surah to Nasser for our brother, our father, our Professor Ibrahim Gbajabiamila. Thereafter, I will call on a member of the Mosque Governing Committee to come and do the vote of thanks. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا آمين. We thank you so much for the beautiful work you are doing in Nigeria, and we hope other people in the Nigerian educational system will learn from your leadership and will learn from your style, build on it, improve on it, and cascade it down to the entire educational system and establishment in Nigeria, so that we can get to the promised land where we foresee for our children. Because I don't want to be negative, but I don't think this generation will get there. So we just have to keep preparing the next generation to take us to the promised land. So I'll call on a member of the Mosque Governing Committee. If they are there, I don't know who's there because I can't see your name. Please identify yourself and come and do the vote of thanks before we go, so that we can release Prof and the team. Yes, Elijah, you're speaking. Bismillah.
On behalf of Asalatu Rahman Islamic Association UK, I want to profoundly thank Professor Olashini Gbajabiamila for taking his time to do this wonderful presentation for our association and for the benefit of mankind. We thank him immensely and we pray for him. We wish him well in his current capacity as the Vice Chancellor of Christian University, which is a world known university now, with what you've been doing with your leadership style. We thank you so much and we look forward to hosting you at another time. Thank you so much and God bless you, sir. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of Salatu Rahman Islamic Association in the UK, we thank everyone who has taken their time to join us on Facebook, online, and on WebEx, and those who have been sharing the program. Inshallah, very soon we'll be bringing another scholar again with you. Until then, please stay safe, follow government advice, and then remain alive. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.